Western civilization is moving closer to a point of irreconcilable, unstable equilibrium, as frighteningly increasing numbers of people trust nothing. Media, academia, and especially the governments are no longer held in high esteem. Regaining trust is often impossible after betrayal. However, transparency is essential to any healing process, and that is the essence of the Don Sullivan Show. Please listen to the team explore, probe, and debate cutting-edge science, technology, and computing. Play ball! Welcome back again, everyone, to the Don Sullivan Show, the show where we discuss all things science, technology, and computing on a level that can be understood and absorbed by your average American teenager. I'm your host, Don Sullivan. Thank you all again, and as the vast Don Sullivan Show audience is increasing, I want to continue to thank everyone for tuning in, listening, supporting us. And I want to start off here by saying hello again and allowing my partner and cohort, Mr. Jersey Steve, to introduce himself and say some things. Go for it, Steve.
Yeah, I'm the folk hero of the Garden State. Greetings, everyone. And I just want to make sure we thank our sponsors for today's episode. Today's episode is brought to you by License Fortress, the industry's first and only software asset management firm to offer both a financial and legal guarantee at its highest level of service. Whether it's Oracle, Microsoft, or VMware, License Fortress helps organizations stay compliant, avoid audits, and save money. You can learn more at licensefortress.com. And also, please support our producer, our wonderful producer, Bill Axt. You can visit axtinc.com. That's AXTINK.com. Subscribe to his YouTube channel and help support his efforts to create humorous animation, as well as run our website, all while researching a cure for baldness. He's still working on that.
It's going to go on forever there, Steve. And you're telling you it's not going to work. But, you know,
the Holy Grail.
You never know. This is science, technology, and computing. We have to keep an open mind. But, folks, today, as I have discussed with you, I've told you, we are running these episodes from all over the world. I am at my home base in Colorado. Steve is in New Jersey. But I'm going to introduce you here to my long-term friend and expert on all things ERP and other things, too, in his third or fourth career, Mr. Andre Kemp, who is speaking to us from Melbourne, Australia. Did I pronounce that right, Andre?
Melbourne, close enough.
Melbourne, yeah, okay. So getting it close. Brisbane and Melbourne.
Melbourne, yeah.
I've been to all of these places, and I've gotten in trouble for speaking my New Jersey accent incorrectly there. But today we're going to talk about ERP and enterprise resource planning, and Andre is an expert on all of this, particularly SAP from Germany. But we're going to have an interesting discussion about where it all came from. Now, Andre and I, you're going to see, we're going to date ourselves here, Andre. We've been around for a long time. We were around at the very, very beginnings when ERP was science fiction and fantasy. I had one of the founders of the relational database management system say to me that it was all ridiculous and you're never going to run an entire business based on one single ERP. And then I went to a lecture from a guy in 1994 who was from IBM, who was part of the team that was trying to buy SAP, and it didn't work out. Oh, they wish they had worked that one out, but it didn't. It hadn't worked out. So today, I just want to say that our guest, Andre Kemp, is a former Marine. He's a former police officer. That makes him an honorary cousin of mine from New Jersey, since half of my cousins are former police officers and former Marines. And he's a long-term veteran of Silicon Valley. And as I said, we've spent many, many years at VMware and knowing each other in other capacities. And this is going to be a really fun episode, I think maybe as compared to some of the more recent ones we've done. But this one, we're going to get back to our flippancy and some of our irreverence. So say hello. Did I introduce you okay there, Andre?
Fantastic. Well done.
Okay.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. But, I got to stop for a second. And because first, at the insistence of all of our lawyers, I need to read out the obligatory disclaimer waiver that all statements by the host and guests of the Don Sullivan Show are the personal opinions of the host and the guest, who all agree that the following content is the property of Xanalytics LLC to be used publicly and exclusively on the Don Sullivan Show. Everybody is nodding their heads. I know the audience can't see this because this is audio only, but we're all nodding our heads, so that's okay. And so here we go on. So, Andre, I'm going to hit you with this first question, and we're going to start off, and we're going to make this really broad. We're going to go back to the very beginning. Let's start out defining the concept for our audience of enterprise resource planning. Now, most of the audience, especially the younger ones, would not have heard that term. That comes from the 80s and the early 90s. But enterprise resource planning, once actually referred to as materials resource or material resource planning, a concept that the early pioneers in database theory, for example, believed was just science fiction. It never really would happen. Why don't you tell us or tell the audience what that really is all about and just a little history on how it's evolved over the last 30 years.
Yeah, so essentially, this all came from the need in the manufacturing end, right? To be able to have something that can help with scheduling, documenting, and controlling what was happening on the shop floor. And so, as you said, MRP, manufacturing resource planning, that is what was the first kind of bit of that. And that kind of started out really in the late or early 70s and kind of then morphed over
further than they even realized. Wow.
Yes, exactly. So
I was still playing Little League Baseball.
yeah. So SAP later on, as you know, became the ERP platform of choice. And we'll talk about the naming there in a second. But yeah, the whole idea was that, and this was the mainframe world, right? So there's no PCs, it's all mainframe. IBM's running the show pretty much globally. And anything that you wanted done that was of consequence was going to be probably on a mainframe or other mini frames, as they were called later on, the Wangs of the world and those kind of things, to do these kind of things. But a funny thing happened. Go ahead.
DAX digital equipment and even Unisys.
Yeah, exactly.
Back in those days.
Yeah.
So the young audience of the Don Sullivan Show doesn't know those companies, but they were important. At one point, in 1 year, DEC had more Nobel Prize nominees than the entire Soviet Union. That was, the bad guys before Russia. Okay.
Yeah. So in 72, 4 former IBM employees looked around and said, this accounting package that you guys got going, I mean, essentially everything's got to sum up to zero at some point, right? I mean, accounting is math, and so math is
That's what the Medici said.
Straightforward. What's that?
That's what the Medici said back in the 1300s. Yeah, and they did it with double entries.
And so when they did this, the first product that they actually came out with was for Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI. And that was their very first product, and they focused exclusively on financial accounting, right? So it handled the general ledger, accounts payable, and financial statements. And so they shipped this on IBM mainframes using assembler language, and then it transitioned to a modular structure, and that was called SAP R1 in 73. And so another thing that folks want to know, what does SAP stand for?
What
if you really want to
take up, I don't even know. Is it German?
Yeah.
Gotta be German,
so
right?
It's an acronym, right? So System Anwendungen und Product in der Dataverarbeitung. So essentially it means systems, applications, and products in data processing.
That's so German. It's just very to the point, specific. That's great.
So
if you got a company that's telling you have to change your entire business process to actually own the software, they get to have their own name as exactly as corrected as possible.
Yeah. And so if you want to tick off an SAP employee, call it SAP, right? They really hate that.
I'll
because
remember
the
that.
Germans, the Germans didn't realize, that, even though they had the acronym SAP, and in German, it's common to have companies that are, it's not a word, it's the actual letters, and people just say the letters, and SAP was one of those. But they didn't realize till later on that in the English-speaking world, especially in the States, that SAP is, somewhat stupid.
They're a SAP.
Or,
they weren't a SAP when IBM tried to buy them. They were very astute.
Yeah, so they didn't really like that, and so they definitely want to get on the right foot of someone in SAP. Always make sure you say SAP, and you'll be fine. But essentially, they were the, I would say the first of what became later ERP to actually look across broadly and say, there's all these business processes, and we have a system for HR running some other software. We got this finance thing doing whatever they're doing. The warehouse is doing, something else over here. Why don't we integrate? And they're all tied in together. So why don't we integrate these pieces together? And that's where R2 came from. So in 79, SAP R2 brought in logistics, HR, and then finance, which was already there. And that became a kind of a multi-module, and again, still mainframe based. And that essentially was the game changer, because not only did you have the warehouse says that X number of widgets got sold, it automatically would update the finance side saying, this is a profit that you've achieved this quarter. And then also HR would have a ping that says, you need to actually start hiring some more people because we're expanding in these different areas. And so it was really a way to actually tie the businesses together. And then when 1992...
did they have supply chain built into this at this point?
Not then, but and because that came out around supply chain management started popping up in the
that's
late
the way you
90s.
tie it all together, right? I mean,
yeah. So 92 is when SAP R3 that pretty much started the whole. We've moved away from the manufacturing resource planning, and Gartner is the one that coined the term enterprise resource planning. And so what that did is it added sales and distribution, and then all these different modules, plant maintenance, materials management, HR was there, of course, from the beginning, and the finance, of course, was there from the beginning. And again, it's that whole, if I do one thing in this part of the business, it automatically gets translated across the different modules. Now, the timing, the reason why this 1992 thing is important is because, as you mentioned earlier, Oracle jumped on the bandwagon early with the whole third normal form RDMS, right? And that was the game changer. Be able to have, these keys that can focus on rows and just no transitive dependency and non-key attributes and that kind of stuff. And to be able to do that, Oracle was able to get in early for these very high transactional type of environments. Because when SAP, because it was IBM, DB2 pretty much, had a lock on that stuff, right? And it wasn't until the advent of PC-like technology, i.e. x86, that, people have an alternative to get off, expensive mainframes to start using x86, but using a robust database such as Oracle. And so Oracle really became the go-to installation between, for customers to choose. You had Informix in there as well. You had a couple other also brands that are Sybase. Yeah,
I remember my thesis in Sybase. Got to remember that.
Yep. But and they're the dustbin of history. Most of these other vendors, but And those are all, and other key thing that SAP did, and it was essentially, the Novell model was creating certifications, right? And so becoming an SAP certified basis administrator or a functional consultant, and then that's the people part, but then the hardware vendors and the database vendors and the operating systems all had to go through the strict certification process.
And the word strict cannot be overemphasized, right? It is absolute German perfection and strictness, and that's how they gain control over the entire industry, and that's how they gain control over all their customers, really.
Yeah, I mean, there was, if you wanted to put an SAP system, you knew, one, it was going to be complex, it's going to be expensive, and there's going to be a lot of hoops you're going to have to jump through. And that was just the early days where literally, and I installed my first SAP system in 97, RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and installation was usually 3 days. That's just to install it. I'm not talking pre-configuration or anything. That's just to install the system, because the storage was very slow back then, right? SANS was just starting to emerge, so you didn't really have, a lot of fiber and all that stuff. So, I'm using, what was that compact RAID array called back in the day? That compact RAID array, it leaves me now, but that was kind of like the bee's knees of x86 direct attached storage, and then the CPUs. I mean, they were just coming out with dual sockets. Remember when dual sockets was the big thing, right? And it wasn't multi dies; it was just two CPUs. So it took a long time to install stuff. The networking, you needed to have a dedicated network between the application stack and the kernel and the database stack, which then introduced more complexity.
And again, that was Ethernet at this point. So it's not going back and forth over SAN. You didn't have any kind of, obviously Oracle releases Oracle Parallel Server, and you have multiple instances at that point in the mid 90s that can work on. I mean, this goes on forever and exponentially. But let me take you off in another little bit of a direction here. Sure. Back you hit in the mid to early 90s, there was just this constructive chaos that in the realm of what was now ERP. And so many of the application disciplines will say, Tom Siebel with early Siebel, and of course that was acquired by Oracle, as was PeopleSoft, and others such as F&M, System House. Bond was one I remember that I actually worked on. That they all, as you said, disappeared into the dustbin of history.
Well, that was mismanagement on their part.
Well, it usually is. It was with. Well, we'll get us in trouble here, but that's pretty much a pervasive theme throughout this entire industry on one level or another. It starts out great. They try to do too much, and then boom, they get the wrong people in.
Well, there was also some accounting irregularities and so on.
Well, why? Why do you think SAP, other than the obvious strictness and discipline that they had, why do you think they emerged through all of this before we get into some of the sub-industries, which we will think have gotten created? One of the amazing aspects of ERP in general, I'm going to have you answer this question, is that despite all the consolidation to SAP, these other sub-industries, CRM and the HR apps, that you hear in regular radio commercials every 10 seconds here in the US, have all been created in an amazing fashion. So it's almost like a supernova around SAP where it exploded into these other apps. Why did SAP itself gain so much control? Why did it win that battle, even over Oracle?
Number one was the accounting, right? So FICO, the financial controller modules, which are the the early days of SAP's company.
I thought you were talking about the taxes we get taken out.
Just anything the accounting, global accounting. You're an international company, and most companies that were implementing SAP were multinational companies. I mean, SAP in the early days, until they came out in the early 2Ks with an SMB focus, you didn't go down and, mom and pop shops didn't go, I'm going to put in SAP to run my business. One, it was too expensive. And two, you wouldn't have the money to pay for the consultants to come in and sort it out. But that's sort
of my point. Now you have things like NetSuite that came from all this, which you do. I mean, that's Oracle bought that, of course, too, along with 125 other apps. But you have it, and NetSuite has 20,000 plus customers.
Yeah, and that's again the explosion of SAP in the 90s corresponded also into, remember, Y2K, right? And so once the mainframe folks realized, oh shit, sorry, I don't know if you can cuss on your podcast.
We can.
We give allowances on the Don Sullivan Show.
Yeah, that gets a pass.
A PG, PG rated. If you go too far, Steven will use his magic to take care of it. The PG is fine. So go on, Andre.
Yeah,
we'll give you that one.
Once the mainframe folks realize that they're in a bit of a trouble, that also created a hysteria that we haven't seen for quite some time. And that hysteria was so pervasive that all these, another thing that happened that we've glossed over is, because it was complex to put in, it was the rise of the consultancies, the Ernst & Youngs, the Andersons.
Well, they existed as the big six before that, just as accounting firms.
Yeah, exactly, because they were accounting.
Yeah.
Accounting.
Right.
And so this worked perfectly for them to get on the tech. So you asked why SAP survived. It was like,
well, why they dominated, why the implosion occurred into them,
exactly.
And then the explosion created all these other industries. That's where I'm really interested in.
Yeah, because you have the number one vendor, IBM, right, running the number one database at the time, DB2. Oracle's going to come later on, but DB2 on mainframes with an accounting package and then other modules later on, pushed by the consultancy firms because they were airdropping money, right? Just literally these
could have been coming from the U.S. government. It was so much money.
Were so lucrative. I mean, they're just salivating. And then once this Y2K thing came up, that was just like, here is the golden highway for all of these companies. And so
can you dig into that a bit more, Andre, how Y2K impacted things?
Sure. Because there was this fear, like pervasive fear, that if this code didn't get changed properly.
Yeah, but we're all okay. So many of us are out there. Tens of thousands of us are doing nothing but changing non-structured COBOL code from in date fields, and all making a lot of money doing it. That's what the great fear was around it, right?
Yeah, and then it was perfect timing because this is when, like I was saying, the x86 starts getting bigger, right? And Oracle starts to show up, and customers are saying, you mean, and then R3, and their big thing at that time, I'll never forget this, they touted, we are Y2K compliant, right? All our stuff is Y2K compliant. You migrate to R3, and so folks were getting off the R2 systems, one, because they were highly expensive, it was IBM mainframes, right? And or True 64, right? They were just not inexpensive systems, obviously, and they were moving to the x86 platform because it was proven that you would do an Oracle implementation, then that will work quite well, even though you had to use, you were using Windows in some cases, which people would look at that as an anomaly back then. I did install an NT4 stretch cluster for Bosch braking. That was an NT4 in the early 2Ks.
That was, folks, for the Don Sullivan Show audience that's below 40 years old. That was Microsoft before Windows. So,
and so
that includes you, Stephen.
there is this massive change in the infrastructure that allowed SAP to really, because what they did with R3 was then it opened the door for, okay, I'm not a multinational company, right? So I'm not a Shell or, something like that. But let's say I'm not a bank, but I'm an enterprise customer. I'm a big customer. I can put in ERP. Yes, let's get off because then everybody's going, let's get off. And trust me, this was getting pushed by all the consultancy companies, and they were using the Y2K fear factor. They were using, you need to modernize your business practices. There was all of this, hype of your business is going to, be a dinosaur unless you put in this software. And a lot of implementations, that's when the acronym SAP used to hear, oh yeah, it's called shut up and pay. was starting to be bandied around because it wasn't
You
cheap
should be
to
saying that with a German accent, but we'll give you the Australian one at the moment.
Yeah. So a German guy actually told me that joke. Thought it was funny. Shut up and pay. As that was really the attitude of the company and the consultants, because you had nowhere to go to. I mean, there was no one like Bond was gone. JD Edwards was,
now bought by Oracle after PeopleSoft and
PeopleSoft by
in
Oracle,
a hostile takeover of epic proportions.
Yeah, and then when the interesting thing about that, when that lawsuit came out against Oracle, then it came out that SAP and Microsoft were in talks as a possible merger, and that just shocked everybody. It's like, what? This really process-oriented company is going to merge with Microsoft, and everybody remembers is like this is NT4. Windows 2000 days, right? And so it just, the cultures were so disparate.
I had Windows 98 around now.
So. Windows 98, all that stuff. Yeah, the cultures were so far apart from each other that didn't go through. But it shocked everyone that there actually were in serious talks that Microsoft and SAP were going to merge. And I would also add is that that's when SQL Server kind of showed up. So one of the earliest SQL Server deployments in the world, I was able to be a part of that. It was in 1999, was with Griffiths Foods in New Zealand, and they actually got the okay from SAP to go live on Beta 3 SQL 7.
As long as at least it was an alpha. Again, to the vast audience of the Don Sullivan Show, if you don't know, there really are at this point 3 major relational database management systems. SQL Server, which kind of looks like and acts like Sybase used to, because it kind of came from there. And Sybase, which SAP bought, and we'll talk about HANA later, or how that came from. I wrote my thesis in it, and of course, most of us did all our work in Oracle. So SQL Server, Sybase called their database management system SQL Server, but then Microsoft called it that, so they went to Adaptive Server. That is Sybase.
Yeah, because the proper name was MS SQL, Microsoft SQL
still is the real hardcore. If our friend Deji Kamalafi was on, he would have corrected us by now in a very pretentious manner and been right about it. Hey, I do want to, again, expand off here and ask about, because this implosion thing, I think it's going to get lost in history, because I think it already has been. But all of these, whether or not it was e-commerce or, different the CRM systems. I mean, Salesforce has a 100-story tall building in the middle of San Francisco. But the truth is, even eBay, even and I this is my opinion, but even Amazon, to a large extent, came from these ideas of. That's why I mentioned the supply chain connection to all of this. If it wasn't for being able to connect all these things together, eventually through all of these different products, starting with accounting through supply chain, none of these things happen. And these are massive industries that have all come from this. What else? Do I have that right?
It's amazing. It's amazing that again, it's all about the money. Everyone's and the control. So kind of SAP kind of shot themselves in the foot and the surrounding ecosystem, right? Because the horror stories of implementations, the costs and the rigidness of
you have to change your whole business practice.
Yes.
To the software, which seems like a total oxymoron, doesn't it? Yeah. I remember when I first heard that in the early 90s, like, you got to be kidding. I got to change my business process for a program, but that's it.
That's it. Because if you didn't, and that was the early failures were companies that didn't do that or try to circumvent the process. So do you know, for example, like I'm a certified heterogeneous system copy, which is a fancy way of saying SAP migration specialist, right? The reason why they have SAP migration certifications was because of the DBAs that were trying to cowboy and go, oh, I know Oracle, it's just a database.
That's what Oracle people do.
Yeah, I know how to move this data around.
They're in charge of everything.
We want to go to SQL or Informix or whatever. Yeah, no problem. I can get all the data out of the tables. Well, what happens is that and I won't say who the chocolate company is, but a very large global chocolate company that makes great candy.
There's only two of them, so we'll guess.
The rumor
I think I know.
In the mid-late 90s, an unauthorized, so unsanctioned by SAP, migration occurred, and they lost point-in-time data because they didn't know. Essentially, it was the story that went around in circles with the basis guys was that they had to go back 30 days to get to a consistent state. So when you're talking a global company that doesn't know how much money it has, doesn't know who its vendors are or how to pay them or how to ship product, and then you got to roll back to 30 days, I mean, the millions of dollars lost in not only revenue, but compensation.
That's a lot of M&Ms. Oops, I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah. And so
somebody had to get fired for that one.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. But so then the finger pointing and all that kind of stuff. But what SAP did, rightfully so, because it was people were blaming the software. Oh, you have SAP. Oh, then everybody probably roll the eye rolls. Oh, you have SAP. You're like, no. It wasn't the SAP was the problem. If you actually would have contacted them, they would have, because back in those days, I couldn't do that. They would airdrop their guys in to do that kind of deep level migration, right? And they would have worked with the business, etc. But they didn't want to go through the process. And so this company ended up losing millions. But it also highlighted, because apparently this happened a couple other times, not as big as these guys, but enough to where the support folks were getting inundated with unauthorized database copies and stuff like that. So they implemented a system where, one, you had to go to Germany, right? You have to go through their training on how to export the data properly and import it into your target system. And then you have to take a test. You got the test, you could get certified. So anytime that you wanted to change the OS and or database, that's called a heterogeneous system copy. And you have to use a certified migration specialist, such as moi. You have to submit your project plan to SAP, which approves it. And then you have to do a month worth of migration testing on the test system. And then you can move down your path to do QA and finally production.
Let's talk about this.
Does any other company, sorry, Don, I was just going to ask, Is that unique? Is there any other company that requires something like that, or is that really a very
That's that
unique
strict.
SAP thing?
It's that rigid.
That level of strictness.
No, I would say there's probably something out there that I don't know about, but essentially that's an SAP, because they, that tagline that they have, best run businesses run SAP. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Sure.
It's true when it comes to like, it runs the business.
Yeah.
Right. So if that system is down, right, your business grinds to a halt.
It isn't being run if it's
done.
Well,
it's done.
That's
right.
where I want to take this right now, into this all imposing idea of certification. It's not just on the customers, but it's on the partners and the vendors. And Andre, let's talk about something very personal to you and I. This, of course, we were at VMware for a decade plus, both of us. And we always had the challenge of dealing with the fact that, VMware, vSphere, before the present VMware Cloud Foundation, vSphere is still everything. We both know that, no matter what anybody says. But vSphere is a platform of virtualized hardware. And so it is hardware in any logical sense. Now, once you get to the certifications and the stack, that rigidness is so absolute that we had tremendous challenges at VMware getting through all of that for every single version on every single piece of hardware and so on. As much as we had challenges with Oracle and support and so on, that's a whole different Don Sullivan show, with License Fortress, by the way. But with SAP, it was really very unambiguous. It had to be done with this specific stack. And we're going to get to the next part of this discussion in a minute, but I really want to know from you, do you think that ultimately that rigidness benefited them, particularly when it got to a point 5 to 10 years ago where every major customer in the world was running virtualized? And they, meaning SAP, would acknowledge that 50% of their customers at least were running on VMware somehow. And it sort of became very difficult for everybody. And it was a stifling effect as much as it was, I think, as much as it was a very strong aspect of their persona, if you will. Do you think it held them back? Or do you think it ultimately is what made them as powerful as they are, or both?
I think it's both, because, like I said, in 2004, I joined VMware in Sydney, and that was May. And then it was the following year, I believe, was the last time they had a Sapphire in Australia.
Sapphire is the big signature
conference,
flagship event for SAP, by the way, tech event.
So they had
we all go
Sapphire.
to it. It's pretty business oriented.
Yeah. And at that Sapphire, I had running a ECC system just to show that you could run SAP virtualized. There's obviously it was, wasn't sanctioned by SAP. You couldn't run in production. But the point that I was making was that, hey, you have a bunch of dev machines. It's easier to stand up these virtual machines than to go building all these dev boxes.
It took so long. It took all those years for people from 2004 to 2007, whether it was a focus on Oracle or SAP, to understand that vSphere was vSphere. It made no changes to the operating system. It was a total pure abstraction. It was hardware in every logical sense. And it worked. And that's why VMware became VMware. Why I said in my book in 2014, it was the most important piece of software, along with the Oracle RDBMS. And you might argue that the basic core of SAP, the most important pieces of software ever created.
Well, I would also go further and say that there has not been a significant change to infrastructure since VMware. I mean, there's been derivatives, containers as an example, microservices.
It's sort of the opposite, but you're right. You're right. In that sense, it's a derivative, but it's opposite. It's the abstraction of the operating system as opposed to the hardware.
There's not. Yes, so there has not been a significant change at the infrastructure layer since virtualization from VMware.
And I don't, certainly don't at this point want to make this a discussion about virtualization. I always do, but I always have to be disciplined enough not to in any of these discussions. But I would like to continue with this certification this point. And you answered how you did, and I thought that's the way you were going to say that it was both stifling as well as the strength.
Well, it was hard.
Go ahead, finish.
What was hard, and it's always difficult, is talking to leadership that has no idea what SAP does or operates. Well, and that's
honestly,
always,
they don't know what most of any of this stuff does, right? So
that's always been the challenge. Is like, so it's refreshing when you go, when I left VMware, I'm back at HPE, which was, compact, but, back at HPE. And now I'm back in a company that completely understands. Heck, they have an SAP, practice. It's been there for 30, 40 years, right? So, and it's just refreshing to be able to, hey, this is what's happening, click, 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 and everybody gets it and moves forward. Whereas in the VMware days, I remember one manager was a systems engineer manager, and he's saying, oh, we can just simply migrate them from physical to virtual. And I'm like, no, you can't do that.
Because you're not allowed to.
I went through the whole spiel of what I've just told you guys, and he looked at me like I was lying. I'll never forget the look on his face, like, oh, it seemed like, oh, I'm making this up. So I'm like, look, I'm telling you, you can't do it unless you do A, B, C, and D. And then about a month later, he comes up to me, goes, oh, yeah, you're right. I checked up on that. And
again, it's for the audience. It's not that it can't be done. You're not allowed to do it. And
exactly.
It won't be, it's more that it won't be supported. It's just you're not allowed to. But I would like to, as we continue this discussion about 2017, along comes the cloud. And then all the certification stuff gets infinitely more complicated, particularly at VMware with the VMware Cloud and all of its flavors or manifestations, however you want to refer to it. And it becomes next to impossible, especially since SAP wants to have control of their own cloud, the SAP Cloud, and all of those manifestations. But it's still a virtualized platform. It's still, on all of its flavors, still exactly what it was before in any real sense. But the certifications become, then in my opinion, it really did become very, very stifling, and things wind up, instead of being months delayed, became years delayed.
And actually, it took, as you know, when I was doing the SAP practice in the States in 2010, my first big customer was Grainger.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And Grainger is SAP's largest.
We spent a lot of time in Conagra and Grainger, didn't we, Andre?
Yeah.
Ones who get it done. Isn't that the slogan?
Are we supposed to even mention them? I don't even know if we're supposed to mention them. I might be getting in trouble here, Steve. But
should make them sponsor you.
Yeah, I'd say they should.
They are.
But Andre remembers those discussions.
They are SAP's largest, highest transactional customer, right? So they run more transactions than any other SAP system globally, and so they were asking, hey, is there anyone of our size that we can compare to, to consider this virtualization path? Well, the only customer I had was Fonterra, the dairy company out of New Zealand. And I had convinced them to virtualize the year before. And so they were Oracle, I think True 64, I think they were Oracle Unix, yeah. And they went x86, and I think they went SQL. And, they had a very large footprint, and it was manufacturing, great supply chain, all that kind of stuff. So even though they're not as huge as Grainger, they had all the components that a Grainger would have. That makes sense.
The ones who got it done.
Yeah. And once we were able to convince Grainger to do this, and then that pretty much just opened the floodgates, because it just shut down the grenade throwers in the crowd that says, oh, you can't do that. It's like, well, Grainger can do it. You're not a Grainger, because we got Levi's, then we got, Nike did some stuff. We got CEMEX out of Mexico, Petrobras in Brazil, Marathon Oil, that was a massive one.
I remember
Marathon
that
Oil
too. I think I went there
Yep.
with you as well in Ohio, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And so once you started getting these huge customers, then it just pretty much shut down
But what
the opposition.
get back to the cloud point. What do you agree with me that extra almost amplified or order of magnitude more difficulty in regards to the vendor or the partner in our case? More stifled.
So Microsoft was pretty much out of the gate the first ones that really embraced SAP in the cloud, and SAP themselves contributed a lot to that. So they were able to quickly get their various,
Azure
components.
For those of you in the audience.
Yeah, Azure certified. And then AWS jumped on the bandwagon fairly quickly afterwards. But VMware wasn't going to have a chance in the cloud space. Same with HPE.
We tried.
Once they saw how deep that hole is to put up a cloud, I mean, you're talking billions that you have to throw down this massive hole for literally 10 to 12 years before you actually have a practice. And they realized how deep that hole was, and VMware was like, no, we're not playing that hole. And so that pretty much relegated them out of any type of cloud play, especially in the ERP space.
I hate to cut you off here, but this is so deep and such a historic conversation. And I do want to get all the way to the end. And let's, somewhere around 2017 or so, obviously, SAP buys Sybase in some secret move, which I didn't understand. And out of that comes HANA. You might have a name for that acronym too, but it's basically an in-memory database management system that is kind of ACID. We could argue about that, I'm sure, but it's kind of
HANA or HANA.
HANA. We're Americans. We're from New Jersey. We'll never pronounce it right.
What's the right one, Andre?
What do you call it? HANA, or HANA. And so
HANA,
it's an in-memory database management system that is mostly ACID compliant. Again, that's a whole different Don Sullivan show. And there is a movement towards it. And COVID comes along, of course, and these deadlines get moved back almost half a decade because of it. But there is this deadline. I think it's still 2027, if I'm correct, Andre, in which everything has to be HANA.
Yep, there's two deadlines. So there's the 27, but if you can get extended support to 2033, if you commit to do a RISE, you convert essentially to a RISE licensing scheme. So you can still run ECC till 2033, but then you're going to automatically flip to RISE. Sorry?
You can still use Oracle?
Yeah, you can still use your standard ECC
database. I'm looking at this, and at this point, since I'm out of the game, I'm looking at this like this is the mother of all battles in Silicon Valley about waiting to happen. SAP versus Oracle, and they keep moving it back. So, but you're saying the SAP customers.
So extended support has already been extended a bunch of times.
Yeah, it's because of COVID. I didn't. Yeah. Right. I mean,
they put that COVID, but mostly the sales. There was not the uptick to HANA that the company was looking for.
Well, there's a lot of research done, and you could see that companies were just not moving towards the adoption rate that was going to be necessary to make that date realistic.
Yeah. ECC NetWeaver is rock solid. It's a great platform, and it's companies
you think this will be a bad move for SAP? Or
are they going to win? Is really what I was getting.
This is a heavyweight bout. Who are you putting your money on? Who are we betting on here?
So Oracle is for the first time overtaking them revenue-wise, and I think they're either going to have to cave on their licensing model, or they're going to end up
SAP
losing.
It's going to have to cave.
Yeah. Because
this is speculation, audience, by the way. We don't know anything. No insight or anything from Andre. Just saying.
But you have these third-party vendors, Remedy Street as an example, that are providing.
Oh, good old Remedy Street.
Yeah, providing, in support, support past the end date. So they're writing the code, they're updating the modules. And so customers are like, so, okay, you're saying if I don't go to HANA, then I'll be unsupported. Okay, I'll go and sign up with these guys over here and they'll support me and I'll just stay where I am.
What do you think is going to happen here next? I know you're trying to get yourself removed at arm's length at least, but what do you think is going to happen next, having had this vast 4-decade experience in this?
I think at the end of the day, SAP is going to have to cave on their licensing. That's what I think is going to happen. Just as an analogy, Broadcom is going to have to cave on their VMware licensing. Or they're going to lose customers. That's
we're not getting into that discussion here right now. Don't get me in trouble there, Andre. That we're not going to talk about.
What advice? Get out the bleeper.
What advice, other than hiring you at a very, very high rate and getting you out of the fun you're having right now? What advice do you have for if you were right back in the game with your old customers? What advice would you be giving them right now?
The first thing before I give the advice, I want to find out, do you want to invest in the traditional resources of having an SAP team?
Isn't that the age-old question since the first computer, though?
Well, but yeah, that's what, if you want to, there are some customers that we'll pay to have our own SAP folks. And then the new model is we don't want to deal with the infrastructure. Well, then RISE makes perfect sense, right? Put everything in the cloud. Now, all your basis guys are going to be out of work. RISE is not, unless you work for SAP, but pretty much that's the whole idea, is that you're getting rid of infrastructure and you're getting rid of your on-site team. But there's the big but, is the availability aspect and control. Customers like, well, I want this new feature. Well, you got to wait till SAP decides to upgrade the stack. Well, I want it now. Well, sorry, it's not going to work that way. So it's that whole back and forth argument that you're going to need to have with customers. The same argument you had about, do you go on-prem or do you go to the cloud? All right. And then, do the cost analysis and all that stuff. But it really comes down to control. And I believe that the remedy streets are actually going to, and
the third-party support organizations,
are going to come out smelling like a rose, because I think customers will say, I will save money versus going to this expensive licensing scheme, and I don't have to go to the cloud. I could go on-prem, or I can do a hybrid model where I put
back to the hybrid models. Of course we do.
Yeah. No, but the hybrid model,
the more they remain Yankees Red Sox.
So, for example, Equinix, we all know Equinix, right? And most of these vendors are in an Equinix data center.
At the end of the days in my last life, I was absolutely committed to the idea that the answer to it all was Equinix. It was.
So Equinix is like, and I used to propose this when I was at Dell, was like, you put your compute in your cloud vendor of choice, just keep your data in the Equinix data center. Right.
It's basically an on-cloud, on-site at the same time.
Yeah, and that way you can switch
could have been the same thing, except they didn't really ever get it done, right?
And that gives you the actual flexibility to change cloud vendors at will, right? What happens when you go in and you get the lock-in, and Google's, I think it's the first one to announce. This was like a year ago, I think, where there's no exit fees now if you leave Google Cloud. You want to leave, they're not going to charge you, but there's going to be a charge somewhere, hidden somewhere. But AWS will charge you. Of them. Yeah, but AWS will charge you big bucks for leaving. And when you're talking SAP, you probably got terabytes of data and everything. So you got to watch out. There's always a sting in the tail. And so I would say to customers, look, if you're hesitating to go to HANA, keep your data outside of the cloud. Use cloud for the compute side, because you're going to be an Equinix data center anyway, so you'll have a high-speed connect between the application stake and the data. And then if you want to switch vendors because you get ticked off at AWS one month, you want to go to Azure, or they're having a fire sale, no big deal. You just spin up your application stack on the other cloud.
Honestly, a few years ago in our previous company, that's exactly how we thought it really was going to work, in a seamless fashion, except you never really were able to make it go between those entities. It always had to ping back and forth to some kind of on-prem. But you know what? Hey, Andre, this has been a great conversation. And before I get myself and Stephen and maybe you in more trouble, I think we probably will end it there. But Andre, if you don't mind, with this global discussion here, and maybe 6 months or a year or so, we're going to have you back on to see how our predictions or your predictions in this space actually played out, and see if we got them right, see how we have to adjust. I wish you luck in these other endeavors, because I'm doing the same thing. Obviously, we're moving away. We have our theories as to why it's necessary. We won't go into that either. But thank you for joining us. There's an enormous amount of historical information in you, and I am very, very happy and impressed that the Don Sullivan Show audience could hear it all and hear the predictions. And again, I hope if you're not turned off too much when you hear the actual production posted, that you'll be willing to come back on and do this again with us in 6 months or so.
No problem. Appreciate it.
Steve,
thank you so much, Andre. No, absolutely. And you've got to help us break into Australia. You're our first Australian guest.
That's right. That's right. We're the first Australian. Hey, Andre is a former Marine, like we said. All right. So Andre is truly a global, I hate the term global citizen, but he's a citizen of a lot of places. But he's once a Marine, always a Marine. It's like
outstanding.
All right, folks, we've got a little bit long here, so let me tell you, thank you, everyone, for listening. Please tune in and download again. And always remember, folks, that all at-bats are situational.